All right, guys, today we're going to talk about um, different software development methodologies. And what that means is when you have a team of developers together, and it's more than that, it's the developers, project managers, testers. When you've got a team put together to build some software, how do you organize that team, and um, how do you manage the building process. So we're going to look at that, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and we need this. Okay, so here we go. We're going to learn a couple different methodologies, and then we're going to focus on Agile and Scrum. So the first methodology we're going to look at is called waterfall. Basically, waterfall is a linear approach to software development. And we'll talk about what that means and how that works. Everyone is involved in the design process from the very beginning. And then this idea was designed for manufacturing industries, where physical requirements for development were rigid and structured. So if you had to build a car, you couldn't stop the process in the middle of the process and say, actually, we want to change the body of the car to look like this. Once you have the physical requirements set up for your product, those requirements were rigid and structured. So this is just waterfall at a glance. You come up with the requirements for the project. Then the next step is you design everything, the entire product. Once the designs are all in place, then you implement those designs, you code it out and program it. Then you go into testing, and then you go into maintenance. So what's the problem with waterfall? Why is it something that we've kind of gotten away from? Well, the design process is very long. Designers may not be able to foresee future difficulties until the engineering team has already started their part of the project. And then testing happens a lot later in development cycle, as opposed to testing things along the way. And then, as we discussed a little bit with a couple slides ago, waterfall is very rigid and hard to pivot. So what does pivot mean? When you pivot, it means that you change the requirements and kind of go a different direction. So if you're using waterfall, the waterfall methodology, it's very hard to kind of change directions with your software and make new decisions based on new data that you receive. And then clients won't know what the software is or does until it's released as working software. So you don't really work with clients along the way as you're building their product out. They don't get to use it and test it until it's released as working software. There are some pros for waterfall. The time you spend in the design process can alleviate a lot of bugs, as they can be caught earlier as opposed to discovering them in production. It's very structured. There's rarely a time that you don't know what you're doing and what you're supposed to be working on. When you have the requirements and scope fixed, as they are with waterfall, then waterfall is definitely the right approach. So if you get a project and they say, this will absolutely not change, these are the requirements, this is the scope of the project, then waterfall is a really good way to handle that project. Waterfall places a major emphasis on documentation. So if you have a team member leave before the project is finished, then there's going to be some documentation to explain what they're working on. So waterfall is one methodology, software development methodology, and it's becoming less and less common among tech companies. The more common approach is called Agile. So let's learn about Agile. The Agile methodology is an approach to building software where requirements change over time. There was a manifesto written up about this new approach to building software that kind of took some ideas and say, hey, we can do this better. We don't have to have the rigid structuring of a waterfall methodology. And so the manifesto was written up and gives us very clear guidelines on what Agile is, and we'll go over some of those right now. So in the manifesto, it talked about how individuals and interactions are more important than processes and tools. Working software, so the Agile manifesto prioritizes working software over comprehensive documentation. It prioritizes customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and prioritizes responding to change over following a plan. So these are kind of the highlights of why we even came up with the Agile methodology. So in Agile, we use an iterative approach as opposed to a linear approach. So remember when we saw kind of the waterfall, we saw the picture that looked like, or that showed what waterfall is. It was a very linear approach, top to bottom. There wasn't any repeating of steps. It just went from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. That's very linear. Agile is iterative. And we're going to see some images to describe that a little bit better. With Agile, software is developed in small increments where business requirements may not be fixed and can adapt and change over time. There's user testing throughout the process as working software is released along the way. So you remember back with Waterfall, the working software is released at the very end, all together, just one big release, here's your working software. With Agile, software is released along the way, and as it's released, you can have some user testing through this process. So Agile stresses communication, face-to-face communication, and with less stress on actual documentation. So Agile is made up of very short feedback loops and adaptation cycles. Daily stand-ups are common for collaboration and problem solving along the way. Okay, so let's take a look at Agile at a glance. So with Agile, you start a project and you define requirements, and then you go through a bunch of iteration cycles. So when you start a project, you decide that you want to work on A, B, and C. You work on those 3 requirements. You release those 3 features, and then they get into, after you release them, they get tested, and they go back to the stakeholders, the people who gave you this project, the people you're building this project for. It goes back to the stakeholders, and they can accept it. And if it's accepted, then it gets deployed to the customers. If it's not accepted, if they want some changes, then you implement changes, you adjust, track, reprioritize, and you move those features back into the next iteration, back into development. So these cycles happen. There's a couple more. There's another image we're going to look at in a minute, but these cycles happen usually in about 2 weeks. Sometimes it's 4 weeks, sometimes it's 1 week. But I think usually it's about 2-week cycles, 2-week sprints that you go through this cycle. Okay, so what are some problems with Agile? Really large organizations tend to have a problem with implementing effective Agile. Most implement some hybrid style. Agile tends to be dogmatic, and when faced with criticism, those implementing it tend to lash out, which is actually a thing. It's kind of funny, but that is true. Some see it as simply a management fad that ignores common problems of getting cornered when product failures occur. And then there's this quote from a pretty smart guy called that talks about how Agile can be like a teenager. So let's look at this for a second. Oh, I thought I had it. Well, I had it pulled up. I must have gone somewhere. Okay. Agile is like a teenager. Oh, this isn't the one I want. Let's see. Here we go. Agile's teenage crisis. Okay, so Philip Cruchin went to this, the 10-year celebration of Agile up in Snowbird, Utah, and talked about, wanted to bring up kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to Agile. Brought up some concerns. You can read through those if you'd like. But his quote at the end gets quoted quite often. He said, "The Agile movement is in some ways a bit like a teenager, very self-conscious, checking constantly its appearance in a mirror, accepting few criticisms, only interested in being with its peers, rejecting and block all wisdom from the past just because it's from the past, adopting fads and new jargon, at times cocky and arrogant. But I have no doubts that it will mature further, become more open to the outside world, more reflective, and also therefore more effective." So I will post this here because I think it's a good quote. Oh, there we go. The Agile teenager. So I think this is a good way to describe the Agile movement. It's a bit like a teenager. So it's really good, and it's kind of growing to the point that it's going to be pretty widely accepted. This, of course, was 7 years ago, 7.5 years ago. And I think we're still here a little bit, but I think it is maturing further and further. And in fact, because of this quote, there's been a lot of talk now how still comparing this Agile to a teenager. And since we're now 7 years, almost 8 years past this point, so we're in Agile's 18th year since it was conceptualized. People are talking about how it's now a late teen and almost a young adult, and it's feeling a lot better. So we've kind of kept this this idea of the Agile teenager going even through to today. Get to these. Okay, so with Agile, we often team up Agile development with the idea of the Scrum. What is a Scrum? We're not talking about a rugby term. Scrum is an Agile framework for managing software development cycles. So that's those cycles we showed you a couple slides ago. Scrum is a framework for managing those specific development cycles. So you will more than likely, in some of your interviews, you will more than likely be asked about what is Agile, what is Scrum, have you used them, how have you used them. Companies are very interested in knowing if you understand Agile and Scrum, and if you've ever been or worked with inside an Agile or Scrum environment. So these are really important things to understand. Agile is the methodology, and Scrum is the way to manage the software development cycles within Agile. Progress in your work is organized into sprints, less than 30 days, most often 2 weeks. Small teams, less than 9 engineers. So if you work for a large company and you have 100 developers in that company, and you want to follow Scrum and Agile, then you will split up your group of developers into small teams to each work on their own individual things. There are specific roles within Scrum and Agile. There's the product owner, Scrum Master, and the development team. And we'll go over what those all do. Work is broken down into units or user stories that represent a saga of what the team is building. And then each unit is measured as a task that will eventually equate to a time frame for delivery. And each person on the team decides what they work on for each sprint. So if you think about your Trello boards are, or that kind of setup is often used within Scrum and Agile. It's called the Kanban board setup, where you move cards from columns from left to right. So each card that you have in your columns in Trello would be a unit, and these last 2 bullet points kind of talk about that. Each unit is measured as a task that will eventually equate to a time frame for delivery. So when you're building your Kanban board, when you're building your group of tasks for each sprint, you or your team will work together you'll look at every single card and you'll say, okay, this should take me a day and a half. And you'll put 1.5 on that card, or you'll put a day and a half, however they decide to manage that. So every single card in your Trello board would have a time frame for delivery. And then each person on the team will look at the backlog and drag a card out of the backlog to in progress and be working on that. And they get to decide which cards they're going to work on. So we're going to look at this. We're going to look at a Scrum cycle. We're going to look at what sprint planning is, grooming, implementing, and reflecting. Sorry for the fuzziness, for the bad. We obviously zoomed in on this picture a lot, but this is Scrum at a glance. So each wheel is a new cycle, a new sprint. And at the beginning of the sprint, you have a sprint planning meeting where you look at the scope of what you want to accomplish for this sprint, for these 2 weeks. You look at the product backlog, and the project manager will choose out of the product backlog which tickets should be worked on during this sprint. And then those tickets go to the design team, and the design team will build mock-ups for those tickets. And then we have a sprint planning meeting. So the whole team comes into a room and looks at all the tickets that the project manager and the design team have gone through, and your team will estimate how long each ticket should take and put it into the development backlog, and then talk about if anybody sees any problems with a certain ticket, that's the time that you bring up and say, well, this could cause a problem with this piece in our software. So you bring up any potential problems that you see. So that's a sprint planning meeting. You hold those before every single sprint. So every 2 weeks, you're going to have a sprint planning meeting to decide what the next sprint is going to look like. So now you've built up your sprint backlog. there's some automation that can happen here. Then you go into sprint execution. So for the next 2 weeks, you're working on tickets. You finish one ticket, you move it to testing, a testing column usually, and then you go grab another ticket out of the backlog. And during this time, there are daily scrums or daily stand-up meetings, where you stand up and review what you did yesterday, what you're going to work on today, and any blockers that you have. Then at the end of the 2 weeks, there's a sprint review meeting where you looked at what has been built during this sprint and move anything that wasn't completed into the backlog for the next sprint. Then there's a sprint retrospective, which usually is stakeholders looking at what was built and what's ready to go into production. And then you start again with your sprint planning meeting. So that is a sprint or Scrum cycle. And it just every 2 weeks, you kind of restart that whole cycle. Okay, to wrap up, we're going to just look at some of the specific roles of different team members in this process. So a product owner represents the stakeholders and is the voice of the customer. So they're really fighting for what the stakeholders want and taking requirements down to the development team. They're focused on the business requirements, and they're completely responsible for the product backlog that we saw in the last image. They have a pretty broad view of what's being built on the roadmap, so they know weeks and weeks and months in advance things, new requirements and features that are coming down the pipeline. And they are the piece of communication between the stakeholders and the development team. So your stakeholders could be the CEO, maybe the executive team for your company. The stakeholders could be actual customers that you're building software for. It just means who you're building the software product for. They're the rudder of the ship steering it one direction or another. Okay, Scrum Master, poop emoji. So they're the poop umbrella. They act as the buffer between the product owner and the dev team. So Scrum Masters are your best friend because they make sure that the product owner isn't hovering over your shoulder saying, hey, when's this coming up? When's this coming up? We need to get this done yesterday. So Scrum Masters are awesome. They communicate the product work requirements to both teams and help groom the backlog that the product owner is in charge of. They demonstrate what the team is working on and represent the dev team to the product owner. They help the dev team build out tasks, and they help communication within the dev team and just make sure they're basically the manager, the team manager for the dev team. Typically, the strongest member of the team may be a jack of all trades. Okay, then the dev team. This one's pretty straightforward. The dev team implements the product based on the business requirements passed down to them. They deliver the code each sprint. So every sprint, you should be pushing new code into production. All are involved in estimating tasks, choosing work, and delivering on product requirements, as we've talked about. The daily stand-ups. So the dev team holds daily stand-ups to communicate roadblocks and report on work. It's not a show and tell, more of a check-in. In fact, we call it a stand-up because these daily meetings started taking too long. And so teams started saying, okay, everybody stand up. And they would have the entire team stand up. And that was a requirement that during this daily meeting, everybody stood up. And then that makes it kind of uncomfortable, and people just want to get back to their desks and sit down. So their reporting started to go a lot faster. And then it just slowly turned into being called a stand-up meeting. The dev team receives directives from the Scrum Master and deploys often. Okay, what are some problems with Scrum? Well, one does not simply estimate how long something is going to take to program. That is honestly one of the biggest problems is estimation. It is very hard to look at a ticket and say, yeah, this will take me 7 hours to do, so I will finish it within the next 7 business hours. Or, yeah, that'll take me 2.5 days. Usually, we underestimate how long something is going to take. So definitely one of the biggest problems with Scrum. There's also another problem is there's tons of meetings, so you are pulled away from your computer quite often. A lot of the focus, we usually don't focus on the good because, well, if it works, it works, and we pushed it, and we can move on to the next thing. So usually a lot of time gets focused on the ugly. So there we go. That is the basics of software management methodologies. We talked about waterfall and Scrum, or waterfall and Agile. I will post these slides for you guys in the channel. I'm just going to peek in Slack real quick to see if there's any questions, but I do want to get you guys back to your projects as quickly as I can. I think we're good. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And if you have any questions on waterfall or Agile. Thanks, guys. Get back to work. You're doing awesome. Keep it up. Thank you.